If you want to do some close-up work with your new GoPro Hero 13, you could invest $130 and get the brand new macro lens mod. Or, for around $40, you could get this aftermarket macro lens. Is the GoPro lens really worth 3 times the price? Well, let's find out. When GoPro introduced the Hero 13 earlier this month, they also introduced a series of GoPro branded lenses designed to work specifically with the Hero 13. And this one in particular caught my eye, the macro lens mod. So today we're going to take a, yes I have to say it, closer look at the macro lens mod. We're going to see how it works, how well it performs, and we're also going to be comparing it to a much cheaper aftermarket version to see if it really is worth paying the extra money for. So, as usual, there's a lot to cover, so I'm going to place the chapters up here on the video timeline, but before we get into it, very important to emphasize that this video is not paid for, sponsored, or influenced in any way. I purchased all of the equipment with my own money, and the opinions are entirely my own. If you like our video, please remember to give us a like and also consider subscribing to the channel for a lot more similar content. So, let's get on with it. Before we get to the macro lens, let's just talk for a moment about these new HB series lenses. So, lenses and filters for GoPros are of course nothing new. These have been available from both GoPro and various other aftermarket manufacturers going back several generations of the Hero camera. But what makes these new HB series lenses different is that they are basically smart lenses. So basically on the Hero 13 there is a sensor mechanism, so when you mount the lens to the camera it recognizes what lens that is and it will adjust some of the settings and even disable or enable certain features depending on the needs of the lens, which should be pretty useful to many users as it takes away some of the guesswork and maybe prevents a lot of the trial and error that you might otherwise have to deal with. And we'll see some examples of this when we install our macro lens in just a few minutes. But there are a couple of points worth mentioning when it comes to these HB series lenses. The first being that they are only compatible with the Hero 13. Now, when I say only compatible, I don't just mean that you don't get the smart features with earlier generations. You cannot physically install the HB series lenses on an older generation GoPro, which seems a strange decision to me, but I can only assume that GoPro are trying to force users to upgrade to the 13 in order to take advantage of the new HB series lenses. However, it's also worth mentioning that older lenses designed for previous generation GoPros will still fit on the Hero 13. And of course we will see an example of that when we fit our newer macro lens to the Hero 13 in order to do a comparison test later on. And that brings us to the GoPro HB series macro lens. Now, according to GoPro, this lens will allow you to focus on your subject as close as 4.3 inches away, which they say is 4 times closer than the standard minimum focusing distance. So that would make the standard minimum focusing distance around 17 inches, and that's definitely something we'll test later on. Now, unlike a typical macro lens such as the newer that we'll be testing later on, which has a fixed focus, the GoPro macro lens also has the ability to vary the focus using this focusing ring. And using this focus ring, you can adjust the minimum focus from 4.3 inches all the way up to around about 30 inches, which of course is further away than the standard minimum focusing distance of the GoPro. So that's something else we'll look for later on in the testing. So how about we connect this to our Hero 13 and see how it performs. Okay, so before we can install the macro lens, the first thing we need to do is to remove the standard lens, or better said lens guard, from our Hero 13. The way we do that is simply by grabbing this lens and turning it. You can feel it unlock. You turn it 45 degrees and then it comes off. Now you can see here on both the camera and on the lens these little blue dots. These are used, of course, to align any lens that you put on your Hero 13. So now let's go ahead and install our macro lens. Now it comes in this very nice protective case which keeps it nice and safe. And the idea is that you put it on and off using the case. So basically what I'm going to do here is, once again, I'm going to align the blue dots, place the lens over here, and then turn it. And then I can just simply slide off the case and then verify that it is locked in place. And there my lens is installed. And similarly, when it comes to removing the lens, you simply slide the cover over it and then use the cover to twist the lens off, and it comes off already in the case. Okay, so let's see what happens when I mount the macro lens. Now right now I have it on but not fully locked into place, so as I lock it into place, you'll notice macro appears up here on the screen. And if we now go into our settings, you'll notice that things have changed. So now I no longer have HLG HDR, not sure why that's the case. I only have two choices of framing, 16:9 or 4:3. 1080p has disappeared. Same frame rates as before. You'll notice that my digital lens options have been reduced. I now only have the choice of linear or wide, hyper smooth, on or auto boost. For some reason I can't turn it off now with the macro lens attached. The zoom, you'll notice now, is grayed out, so it's no longer possible to digital zoom. Most of these are going to be the same, but now you'll notice there is a new option called focus peaking. Now what focus peaking does is it superimposes a color on your image to show you which parts of the image are in focus. If you own a more still photo oriented camera, you may already be familiar with this feature. Now the options are, you can have it set to different colors, red, yellow, blue, or automatic, where the camera chooses the color for the best distinction, or of course turn it off. And those are the key differences. Okay, test number one, we have the standard lens, or better said, the lens guard installed on the GoPro. I'm starting around about 3 inches away from the target, measured at the center of the camera where I'm assuming the sensor is. And so I'm just simply going to draw it back slowly from 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Now we'll speed up a little bit. 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, 28, and 30. Okay, now we have the macro lens installed. Once again, I have the camera just 3 inches from the target, meaning that the sensor is 3 inches from the target. I'm also recording the screen that I'm sharing with you here. Right now, I have focus peaking turned on, so as I start my test now and I pull back to around 4 inches now, you can begin to see the red appearing around the text and drawings on the box. And if I continue back to 5, 6, 7, that red has become really intense. 8, 9, 10, still looking good. You can also see the red all the way along the ruler here. We're at 13, 14, 15, 16, Anyway. Alright, so now I have the macro lens installed, but I've turned the focus all the way to the other end for the distance focusing. And once again, I'm starting at 3 inches. I can see from the image that it's very blurry. So I'll go back to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now it starts to come into focus. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, 28, and 30. Now I have the Neewer lens installed. We are about 3 inches away from our target again. Obviously in the app now I have no focus peaking, so we'll just have to rely on what we see on the screen then, or what we see from the final results. So 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So before we get into analyzing the results, I just want to mention that in these type of tests, we are dealing with a very small target being displayed as a small portion of what is already a pretty small sensor. So the resulting image quality is not the best, and that does make it pretty difficult to determine exactly when something is in or out of focus. So with that said, let's start out by looking at the optimum focusing ranges of the 4 different configurations that we saw. Starting with the standard lens, or better said, the lens protector that comes as standard with your GoPro, what we saw there was that things begin to come into focus at a distance of around about 12 inches and basically remain in focus from there on out. Now turning our attention to the GoPro macro lens set to its closest focusing distance, we saw that it was able to focus starting at a distance of around about 4 inches as advertised, and retains that optimum focus up to a range of around about 11 inches, so anything beyond that 11 inches then is out of focus. However, when we switched that macro lens to its distant setting, we saw that the optimum range started at around about 9 inches, which is actually closer than the standard GoPro lens. And although we weren't able to test it in the studio, I'm assuming that everything beyond 9 inches remains in focus. Now, when it comes to the Neewer lens, what we saw there was we were actually able to get a little bit closer to the target, probably around about 3 to 3.5 inches, but we have a very limited range, so we lost focus at around about 7 inches. So comparing the Neewer lens to the GoPro lens, you do have to say that we were able to get a little bit closer to our target. Not only that, but if you compare the zoomed in images from a 4-inch distance for both lenses, you can see that the Neewer lens actually showed significantly better detail than the GoPro lens. However, if we zoom out those same images, you also see an issue of the Neewer lens, and that is as you get further away from the center, there is significant distortion of the image. So some pretty interesting results, but I do feel that these studio tests are a little bit artificial, so I decided to do a more real-world test, and that's what we're going to cover next. Okay, for our real-world test, we're going to be filming some hummingbirds around a feeder. As you can see, I have mounted the camera so that the hummingbirds should be around about 4 to 6 inches away from the camera, which is about the optimum focusing distance for both the GoPro and the Neewer lenses. Now I have the camera set to record at 4K 120 frames per second, which we're going to slow down and hopefully get some really good footage. So let's see what we get. So what is the verdict then with the new GoPro macro lens mod? Well, overall I would say it is a very good high quality product, and it will definitely be very useful to anybody who wants to get high quality footage in that sort of 4 to 12 inch range, which simply would not be possible using the standard lens. Now, if we compare it to the newer range, I would say overall the GoPro lens shows a higher quality image, but you have to acknowledge that with the newer lens you can actually get closer to your subject, and within that operating range of around about 3.5 to 7 inches, the newer will actually provide a sharper and crisper image. However, what lets the newer lens down is, of course, its very limited focusing range, and also the fact that as you move to the outsides of the image quality deteriorates significantly. A couple of other things to talk about in this section, starting with the so-called focusing ring. Now, I think this is actually a very useful feature, but not for the reason that GoPro intended. You see, when you look at the test results, when you set this to the distance setting, we saw that it has a minimum focusing distance of around about 9 inches, which is within the focusing range of the macro setting, but when it's at the distance setting, it will focus all the way out pretty much to infinity. So it's basically like having the standard lens installed. So my take on this is that it's less of a focusing ring and more of an on-off switch for the macro lens, which is extremely useful because you can just mount this lens, switch it to macro when you need it, switch it back to the distance setting when you just want to film normally. Next up, let's talk about the focus peaking feature. Now, I use focus peaking quite regularly when I'm dealing with my mirrorless camera, but I use it mainly when small changes make a big difference to the focus. And that's because a larger sensor camera with the right lens at the right settings has what's called a shallow depth of field, which is basically the distance in front of and behind the subject which remain in focus. Now, with a small sensor action camera, the depth of field is pretty large, and as you saw during our testing, when we have this set to the macro setting, pretty much everything from 4 inches to 12 inches is as well focused as it can be. So in that kind of situation, the focus peaking really isn't helping you that much. When you install the macro lens and place it to its closest focus setting, as long as you can ensure that the camera is between 4 and 12 inches away from the subject, it's going to be in focus. Ironically, the focus peaking feature would be a lot more useful with something like the newer lens, which has a much more limited focusing range. But as we saw before, unless you have the GoPro macro lens installed, you cannot get the focus peaking feature. Or can you? Well, as it turns out, there is actually a workaround to get the focus peaking feature with any lens. The way it works is basically you disable the auto recognition feature and you tell your Hero 13 that you have the macro lens installed, and that way the focus peaking feature will be available. However, as we saw earlier, that will also disable certain features like the ability to do HLG HDR, the ability to record 1080p, and so on. And by the way, using the same workaround, when you do have the macro lens installed, you can also tell your Hero 13 that you don't have it installed in order to open up those features that otherwise would not be available. So that wraps up our review of the new GoPro macro lens mod. I hope you enjoyed it. If so, please remember to give us a like and consider subscribing to the channel for a lot more similar content. If you have any questions, any comments, if you have suggestions for follow-up or future videos, please drop those into the comments section. Otherwise, thank you for watching.